In this video, we'll be going over using a PBR material in BabylonJS. PBR stands for Physically Based Rendering, and it will allow us to create more realistic environments. Now, PBR is a modern material workflow that simulates how objects would react to lighting in a real environment. With our PBR environment, we'll also look at creating an environment texture from an HDRI, which can then be used for lighting, as well as a visual representation of a sky using a Skybox. We'll also briefly discuss channel packing and how to utilize grayscale texture maps that are combined into one. Lastly, we'll take a look at using an emissive texture and how we can create a glow layer. So with that said, let's get started. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio Code. Let's get started with our class. So in the Babylon examples, let's create a new file in here called PBR, all capitalized, .ts. Now, just like I did in a previous video, what I want to do here is take what I had in the basic scene. I want to copy it over. This includes all the basic setup that we need. I'm going to paste this in my PBR TS file. I'll rename the class to PBR. Now, if you want to follow along with the same code, I will be providing a link to the code repository in the description. All right, so before we take a look at actually adding anything else to this class, I want to download a few different things. I do have these assets already downloaded and included in my project to save on time, but I'll show you where you can download these yourself. Okay, so here we are on Polyhaven. Now, Polyhaven is a great place to download textures, models, and HDRIs. These are all free, and I will be providing a couple of resources in the code repository for some of the stuff that we are going to be using in this video. So let's start off with the HDRIs first. The HDRIs are going to be used for the Skybox and the environment lighting. The environment lighting is going to be useful for PBR. So you can download any of these in here. You can see we have different sections. And the one that I'm going to be using is called Wide Street 02. So with the 3D option selected, I can take a look around. I believe this is either a 4K or an 8K resolution. And we can use this as a Skybox in Babylon, and we can take a look around just like we can in here. I'm mostly concerned with using the HDRI for the environment lighting, so that really works well with PBR environments. Now, if you want to use the same version, I use a 2K resolution with HDR, so you can download this. I already have it downloaded on my desktop, and we're going to convert this into an environment texture we can use within Babylon. It's going to be about half the size, but it's still going to have the same resolution and the same quality. Along with this, we're also going to be using a couple of new textures. So if you go back to the original page, you can click on textures and you can look for the texture we're going to be using called Asphalt. So I'm going to be using this one here, Asphalt 02. And for this, we're just going to be using 3 of the textures from here. So again, I'm using a 1K resolution. And this time you want to use the AO rough metal combination. Roughness and metal maps are used with PBR. And with this basically combined into one texture. I'll go over how we can separate these out in our code. So you want the AO rough metal, and I'm using the JPEG version. You also want the diffuse, which is the color map. And then we're also going to be using the normal. Again, these are all JPEG versions. So I do have these already downloaded and included in the project. Now, the last thing I am going to be using comes from gametextures.com. Now, in this case, I'm not going to provide the textures that I'm downloading from here because these are paid assets. You will need an account to actually download these. And if you want to download the one that I'm using, it is part of a membership. Now, you can download some free versions here. You will need to sign up with a free account, but there are a ton of great resources, a ton of great textures we can actually get from gametextures.com. Now, the textures I'll be using are called Magic Curves Stone Floor. And the reason why I'm using this is because, first off, it is a stylized texture. It is PBR, but it is stylized in that it's not realistic. So the main reason why I want to use this is because it has this nice emissive map. So I'll be going over how we can use an emission map within our PBR environment. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we can use the HDRI image as an environment texture. For this, I'm going to be using a tool from BabylonJS. So if you go to babylonjs.com/tools/IBL, you'll find this tool here. And this will allow you to convert an HDR image into an environment map. So you drag in an HDR in here. So here is the Wide Street 02. I can drag this in here. And once it's done processing, you should see something that looks like a unwrapped box. It's going to ask you where you want to save it. I'll just save this on my desktop as well. Now, the reason why it looks like this is because it's typically used for a skybox. A skybox is going to be using this image, and if you were to think of a box unwrapped, this is how it would look. So think of these as the faces of the box. So everywhere we look in our skybox, we're going to see an image. So we're always going to see something in that sky. Now, again, I'm mostly concerned with the lighting from this image, but I will be going over how we can use this as a skybox in Babylon. Okay, let's take a quick look at the differences between the HDR file and the ENV file. So if I hover over the HDR file, this is a 5.8 megabyte file. If we take a look at the ENV file, this is 2.69. So it's almost half of the original size. And this is very important when we're working with Babylon. Again, we're thinking about the performance of this. So anything that allows us to get something a little bit smaller, a little bit more performant is always great for our browser. Okay, let's jump back into the code and let's take a look at how we can use these. Okay, so going back into our code, let's take a look at the public folder real quick. So in here, I included the environment folder, which has my environment file. I renamed it to Sky. And then in the textures, we have the asphalt and the magic textures. These will not be included in the code repository, but I will include the asphalt and the sky.env. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is actually reference the environment texture that we have in our public folder. And we'll do this in the create scene. So the way that we will do this is by first creating a cube texture, and then we assign that to the scene. And then we'll take a look at how we can use that as a skybox. So I'm going to say const env text equals, and we'll write out cube texture. And make sure that you hit enter so you can actually import that at the very top. So cube texture. And then we want to use create from pre-filtered data. Right, this is going to require a URL, so a path to that file. So that's going to be the sky.env. So // and we're looking for environment / sky.env. And we're going to add it to the scene. Now, since we're in the create scene, I'm actually referencing the scene variable right here. Right, so we created the environment texture. Now we need to add it to our scene. So right below that, I'm going to say scene.environment texture, and I'll set it to env text. Okay, now by assigning this as the environment texture, we're not actually going to see the texture in the background as the sky, but I can then use this for the environment lighting. So if you don't want to use this as a sky texture, either because it's low resolution, or maybe you want to use a completely different skybox altogether, you can just leave it as is. But I do want to show you how you can set this up as a skybox. Now, within Babylon, we can also create defaults. So if I go to scene.create default, and we'll just start off with the environment. The create default environment has its own preset environment texture that you can use. So if you don't want to use your own HDRI, convert it to an environment texture and all that kind of stuff, you can just use the default environment to quickly set that up for you. But since we do have an environment texture, we can go down and say create default skybox. And with this, we have an option to provide the environment texture. So we want to use the env text. Now, one of the options in here is to use PBR. We are using PBR, so we'll set that to true. Right, we'll go ahead and save that. Now, we haven't included this in the main front-end components, so we'll go ahead and set that up real quick. We'll go into components, Babylon examples. I'll swap out the standard materials for the PBR class we just created. Okay, and then we're going to run npm run serve in the terminal. Okay, so let's take a look at our current scene. So on the front end, you should see something that looks like this. So now I'm using this as a skybox, and with a 2K resolution, as you can see here, it doesn't really look that great. But we will be able to actually use the environment lighting from this, and we have a basic skybox in the background here, which is great. Now, we don't really see much of a change in our environment in terms of the 3D objects here, and that's because these are using standard materials. They're not using any kind of environment lighting with PBR. So we're going to be starting off with the ground. The ground object here is going to have the asphalt texture. The sphere is going to have the other texture, the magic textures. So let's get started with our first material. This will be the PBR material for the asphalt for the ground here. I'm going to leave the server running. Let's jump down below the create scene method here, and I'll create a new method for creating each of the materials that I want to use. This will help to keep things nice and organized. So after that, I'm then going to assign it to the ground.material. So I'm going to create a method here called create asphalt. So we know exactly what it is. And I want to return a PBR material. Okay, so make sure that you select PBR material. There are different types of PBR materials we can use in Babylon. There are some basically preset versions of these. So we have the PBR metallic roughness. There's also a specular glossiness. This just refers to the different types of maps we can use in PBR. We just want to use the PBR material as is directly. Okay, it's going to complain that we haven't actually returned this yet. So let's go and create that at the very top. I'm going to call this PBR, all lowercase, and I'll set that equal to a new PBR material. And I'm just going to call it PBR as well. And we need to assign it to this.scene. Right away, I'm just going to return it. So return PBR. All right, before we take a look at adding any kind of textures, let's assign this to the ground. So I'm going to do this at the very bottom here. And we may run into an issue. If we do run into an issue, I'll show you how you can resolve it. So we're going to say ground.material. And I'm going to set that equal to this.create asphalt. So remember, we're returning a PBR material. So now we're assigning that to the ground material. I'll save this real quick. Let's jump back to the front. Now, if you experience this error right here where you don't actually see anything, you can open up the console. So right click in the window, go to inspect and open up the console. And you'll probably get a warning that looks like this: cannot read properties of undefined. Now, I'm not really sure why this appears. I believe it's probably a timing issue or a lifecycle issue. So what we can do is actually go back into our code and we can move all the mesh elements into a separate method. All right, so back in our code, what I'm going to do is take everything that refers to any kind of mesh element. So everything that doesn't refer to the actual scene, I'll take it out. So I'm going to cut this, everything from the ground to the sphere. And I'm going to create a new method right above the create asphalt. I'm just going to call it create environment. And it's not going to return anything, so I'll just say void. And I'll paste everything in there. So we have the ground, we have the ball, we have the ground material, all that stuff. Now make sure that you call this up above. That way you actually create the environment. So right below the this.scene, I'll say this.create environment. All right, let's jump back and see if that resolved the issue. All right, so with that resolved, we should see what we see here. Now, one of the things you'll notice right away is that our ground looks like a mirror. So the reason why that happens is because within a PBR material, we have a roughness value. The roughness value determines how smooth a surface looks. So by default, it's set to 0. So with a roughness value of 0, it's going to have a very, very smooth surface, which is going to result in this mirror-like look. Now, one of the other things I also want to change is the speed of the camera. You can see as I move around, it moves very, very quickly. So let's adjust the camera speed, and then we'll take a look at the roughness of that material as well. Okay, so let's go back into the create scene. Right below the camera attach control, I'll set this to camera speed equals 0.25. All right, now let's jump back down to the other method, the create asphalt. And now I want to adjust the roughness. Now the roughness can either come as a numerical value or as a texture. So we can use both a texture and a numerical value to kind of fine tune the roughness of the material. So I want to start off by saying PBR.roughness. Roughness is a numerical value. Make sure that you select roughness, not the roughness material. And I'll set that equal to 1. Okay, we'll save this real quick and we'll jump back and take a look at it. Okay, there we go. Now you should be able to move around. We should be moving a lot slower now, but you should see that we no longer have that extreme shine. It no longer looks like a mirror. Now it is a bit bright, and that's because we're taking into account both the lighting from the environment, but also the hemispheric light. So let's turn off the hemispheric light and let's just use the environment lighting for the materials. Okay, so let's go back into the create scene. Where we have the hemispheric light, you can either remove it or turn it off altogether. I'm just going to go and set this down to 0 for the intensity. That's basically like turning it off. I'll leave it in here, but once we do that and I save this, we should see the lighting appear on the ground, but you'll see something different with the sphere. Okay, so you can see that the lighting on the ground looks almost very similar to what it looked like before, but the sphere actually looks pitch black. And the reason why it appears that way is because the sphere is using a standard material. It's not using the environment lighting. So it thinks that there is no lighting at all within a scene because the hemispheric light was set to an intensity of 0. So we are going to be modifying that in a moment after we create the material for the ground. But now we can add in our textures and take a look at how that looks with the ground. Okay, let's go back into the Create Asphalt. And now we're going to be using the textures from the Asphalt folder. So we're going to start off with the Diffuse. Now note, the Diffuse texture is not the exact same thing as what you would use for the Albedo texture, but it is going to be very similar. So we're going to add in the Albedo texture. We'll say PBR.albedo texture. So we also have an albedo color. It's very similar to the color tint of other properties of a material. So the albedo texture, we're going to do this inline. So before we did this separately, but we can also do this inline. There is a slight issue doing it inline, which I'll mention in a moment. So I'll set this equal to a new texture. And we want to provide the path. So that's going to be the public textures asphalt folder. All right, so we added in the albedo texture. Again, we're using the diffuse map for that. All right, so going back into our scene, now we can see our albedo texture being applied to the ground, and it looks quite nice. Now, there is one caveat with using this. I'm not sure if this is a Babylon issue, or maybe it has to be set up in a different way. But if we take a look at the code, if I want to adjust the tiling of the texture, I cannot access the tiling or the UV scale of that texture directly. So if I write out pbr.albedo texture dot and I start typing out U scale or V scale, you can see it doesn't pop up. It actually doesn't even appear at all, even if we type it out. So if I were to hover over this, it says, hey, it doesn't exist on base texture. I'm not really sure why this appears as such. If I do actually create this separately, it will have access to the U and the V scale. But in this case, if we do it in a line like this, it doesn't appear. I'm not too worried about that in this case because I'm going to leave it as is, but just keep that in mind. That is something that I did happen to find. All right, let's continue with the rest of the textures. So we're going to add in the normal and then the AO, rough, and metal we'll take a look at in a moment. So for the normal, this is also a bump texture within a PBR material. So PBR.bump texture. And I'm just going to copy this from up above. Okay, that is the asphalt normal. Again, we'll take a look at this. Now with the normal map, in most cases, you will need to invert this. It's a little bit hard to tell with the color map being applied, but you should be able to see that the cracks right here actually stick out. Same thing with the ground. All the bumps actually stick out. If you ever want to know if you need to invert the normal map, you can actually turn off the color map. So here, I'll turn off the albedo texture by commenting it out. We'll jump back in. And if you move around, you should see the normal map. So we see all the lighting being applied, and you can kind of see that everything is kind of sticking out. I want this to actually go inward, not outward. So I'm going to re-enable the albedo texture, and we're going to invert the map. So we'll say pbr.invert. Now remember, we want to do this for both the X and the Y axis. It's going to be a little bit hard to tell with the color map, but now it's properly set up. All right, now let's take a look at using the AO, which is the ambient occlusion, roughness, and the metal maps. Now, with these combined maps like this is using something called channel packing. This works when you want to use a grayscale image for different channels within one bigger texture. So AO, roughness, and metal maps are all grayscale. So I can use the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel all within one texture. So we're going to reference each one of these by their channel, but we first need to assign the texture to something within the PBR map. So we're going to be assigning this to the metallic texture. I'm going to say pbr.metallic texture. Okay, so we now have a texture to reference, and I'm actually going to do this right above the metallic texture. What I'm going to do here is say PBR dot, and we'll type out use. Now, with these use properties here, we can use the ambient occlusion, and take a look at this. If you read it over here, it says you want to specify that you want to use the ambient occlusion from the metallic map from the red channel. So if we read this from left to right, that's going to be red, green, and then blue. So make sure that you use ambient occlusion from the metallic texture red. And we'll set that equal to true. We're going to do the same thing for the other texture maps. So we have the roughness and the metal. So pbr.use, and I'll say rough. And with the roughness map, you can use it either from the green channel or the alpha channel. So make sure that you do use the green channel. Okay, so use roughness from metallic texture green, true. And then lastly, we'll do the same thing for the use metallic texture. So in this case, you're going to use the metalness from the metallic texture blue, right? So red, green, and blue. Okay, so we'll save that once again. Let's take a look at this. Okay, so there we go. Now we can see the difference. Okay, great. Now let's take a look at using the sphere. So for the sphere, we are going to be using a PBR material with an emission map, and I'll show you some common gotchas you'll find with that. Let's jump back into our code. Now, just like I mentioned before, we are going to create a separate method for each of our materials. So I'll create this below the create asphalt. We're going to call it create magic. Okay, this refers to the magic textures. This will also return a PBR material. All right, so we created the shell of the method. Let's assign this up above. So I'm going to say ball.material equals this.create magic. Okay, so here we are on the front end. You can see what this looks like. So again, the roughness value is set down to 0, which creates this mirror effect, and it's reflecting what we have in the background here. We're not actually using the ground or anything like that. All right, so jump back into the code and let's adjust the roughness value, and then we'll add in the other textures. Okay, so I'll set that up to 1 for now, and we can remove this once we actually use our map. So let's actually go back into the create asphalt. Since we're no longer using the roughness value here, we're actually getting that from the map. I can remove this altogether, and I'm no longer applying any kind of difference. So I can fine tune the roughness or even the metallic values by including a numerical value down below, along with the texture that we actually want to use. But I just want this coming directly from the textures themselves. So in our create magic, we'll do the same thing as up above. So we're going to add in the albedo texture. We're going to add in the roughness. We're going to add in all that stuff. Okay, and note that I am using a PNG file for these. These are the types that we get from game textures. These are a bit higher quality, but they will be a little bit bigger in terms of resolution and the size. So I'm using a base color. That's also a very common name for a PBR color map. Okay, jumping back over into the front end. If you ever do see something that looks like this, like a checkerboard, that's because it doesn't know where that texture exists. Either it is missing or maybe there's something wrong with the path. In my case, I actually messed up the path to where this texture is located, but I did want to leave this in here so you guys can know if you do experience this issue yourself. So going back into my code, you can see here, I'm looking for a folder called magic, but I forgot to include the parent folder, which is textures. That's why it's showing up as a checkerboard. All right, so there we go. Okay, so I've added in all the basic textures that we need. We have the albedo, the bump texture. I've inverted the normals. I've included all the different maps here that are combined, the AO, roughness, and the metalness. So if we take a look at what we have so far, we have this sphere that basically just looks black. So now we need to add in the emission texture or the emissive map. So for the emission texture, it's called magic_emissive. An emissive texture is basically just a black and a color map. So black is areas where we're not going to have any kind of glowing effect. And then the color portions are the portions that are going to be glowing. Now this can be whatever color you want, as long as it's not black. So if it's white, if it's any other color that other than black, it'll glow. So we're going to be using this as our emission map. So to add that in, we're going to say PBR.emissive, and we're looking for emissive texture. And again, I'm going to use the texture from up here. Okay, now there is going to be a weird issue. When you first add this in, you added in the PBR.emissive texture, and then you take a look at this on the front end, it doesn't really look any different. And the reason why this doesn't look any different is because by default, there is an emissive color property that is being utilized. That emissive color is actually black by default. So if you have anything that's black with emission, it's not going to glow at all. It's just going to look black. So let's go back into our code. And right above the PBR.emissive texture, I'm going to say PBR.emissive. And if you scroll up a bit, you'll see emissive color. Okay, this is a color 3. If you want to utilize the same color as the color that's in the texture map for your emission, you want to set this to a color of white. So this would be a new color 3, and white is going to be 1, 1, 1. All right, so make sure that you set the emissive color, because by default, this will be black, which means we're not going to have any kind of emission at all. So it's basically providing a tint or a mask over the emissive texture. Okay, so now we can see that this is actually glowing. Now it does look like it's glowing, but it's really not that strong. So we can adjust the intensity of this, and then we're also going to be adding in a glow layer. Let's first adjust the intensity. So I'll just do this below the emissive texture. We say PBR.emissive, and here we have the emissive intensity. So I'll set this up to a value of say 3, which is actually quite large, but we'll see what this looks like with that emissive intensity. Okay, now it's starting to look a little bit more like it's really glowing. It's not actually casting any kind of light. It does look like it's glowing, but we don't really get that feel of it glowing. So we need to now add in a glow layer. This will actually allow us to create this kind of fuzzy effect where it actually looks like it's emitting light. So if you ever want to have something that looks like it's glowing, you need to use a glow layer. So for this, I'm going to create a variable called glow layer. So const glow layer. And I'll set that equal to a new glow layer. Okay, this is from BabylonJS. And we need to provide a name. So I'll just call it glow and then add it to the scene. Now I made this into a variable because we can adjust the intensity. So glow layer dot intensity, and we'll just start off with a default value of 1. Okay, so now we can see what that does. Now it creates this kind of fuzzy effect. Now again, we have two different types of intensity with this. We have the glow layer intensity, and we have the intensity for the specific emissive texture. Right, so we have two different types of intensity. We have the emissive intensity here. If I bring this down to 1, maybe bring this up to say 4, now this is really, really glowing. All right. Now this glow layer is going to be applied across the entire scene. So if you have other emissive textures, it's going to be applying the same intensity to those as well. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce both the intensities. Okay, and I think that looks pretty good for the most part. Now there is one other thing I want to mention, and that is the environment intensity. Let's say you want certain objects in your scene to have less intensive lighting coming from the environment. Let's say I want the ground to be a little bit darker, or I want this thing to be a little bit brighter, whatever that may be. I can adjust the intensity from the environment lighting per either PBR material or overall. So I'll show you how you can set that up. So if you want to adjust the intensity across the board for everything, we can do this in the create scene. So right after we actually create the environment texture, I can say scene.environment intensity, and I can set that to a lower value. So let's say I set that equal to 0.25. Now you can see everything else is quite dark, and you can see even the skybox is darker as well. So everything is much, much darker. Now that is a value if you want to reduce the intensity overall. But let's say I want the ground to be brighter than the sphere. I want the sphere to be a little bit darker because it has the emissive texture. So I'll go back and I'll turn off the scene environment intensity, and we'll do this per the PBR material. So for the create magic PBR material, I'll do this right below where we create the material. I'll say PBR.environment intensity. So same thing as before. And I can set that equal to 0.25 as well. All right, so now the ground is still using the same intensity as before, but the sphere is much darker. It's not taking in as much environment lighting. Okay, so there you go. Now we have an example of how to use PBR materials within BabylonJS. We went over how to set up PBR materials, how to set up things like the skybox from an HDRI image that was converted into an environment texture, how to set up things like the environment intensity per PBR material, and how to also utilize the glow layer with the emissive textures of a PBR material.